one of the things that I'm interested in, difference between nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations. And so if you would just have to take a guess or assessment at running a nonprofit compared to running a for-profit organization, like managing one, leading one, what would be more difficult? Do you think it's more difficult to manage a nonprofit, or is it more difficult to manage private sector for-profit companies? So we're going to do it by raise of hands. So if you think it's more difficult to manage a nonprofit company or organization, raise your hand. And if you think it's more difficult to raise a for-profit company, raise your hand. You guys drank the Kool-Aid or something. That's why. This is not,
You have to raise money, like fundraising.
So your revenue streams are challenging to secure funding. Okay, so the incentives, like you can't hold money as the major incentive to motivate people. There's other incentives. Yeah, Maddie.
For me, like the most stressful thing when I think about it is that you need to be ready to back up anything you do. You need to be ready to like justify anything that you do. There's not like that, like, oh, I just want to make money. It's like, how are you helping?
You need to defend your
defend
actions.
Yeah.
So, and even like Orlando Magic, which just raised $23 million, people are saying, well, what are you going to do with that money now? And you need to like show very clearly. Whereas if you're a for-profit company and you had profits of $23 million, it's just like, well, you redistribute it to the stockholders. And yeah, Brandon.
Bryce's first point in that, there's a lot of other reasons of why it's harder to run a different company, whether that's nonprofit or for-profit. And it's the people that go into that area that they're good at in those different ways of how it's easier for them to be able to run these different companies or to run these nonprofits because that's what their mindset is about. And I've learned through different years that different people have many different skills and different ways and think differently. So if you think for profit, then that's gonna be much easier for you to be able to run that company. If you think nonprofit, of being more creative, using your resources in more creative ways instead of so streamlined in how the business is run, then you'll be more successful in that way or another, and it won't be stressful. It'll be more passion.
Because of your experience. But then a lot of people pivot from working for a for-profit company to working for a nonprofit, or they go the other way. And I would say they're not distinct skill sets. The big part is running an organization. Both have employees, both have budgets, both have marketing, both have a product or a service that they're producing or providing. So maybe specific industries, like you get your skill set within specific industries, but running an organization, I don't know if there's as much difference in the for-profit or nonprofit. Hannah.
In one of my classes, we read a book called Good to Great in the social sector. And the first page, it talks about how different skill sets aren't skill sets of a business or business skill sets versus nonprofit. They're just human skill sets. And so I found that really interesting because it's not
like relational.
Just sort of it focus on the word discipline.
I see.
Like being a disciplined person.
I see.
Following discipline in a job setting. Isn't a business characteristic. It's a human developed characteristic, and I think that can be applied a lot to management. In fact, it's not whether it's harder to run a for-profit or a non-profit. It's finding a person who has the skill set to run either of them, and whether they would be compatible for both or just one.
Sure. Yeah. And which class is that for?
It's for inside community arts organizations.
So the book is Good to Great, and what's interesting about that book is it was written for the private sector. The original book is From Good to Great. How do you take your organization from being a good one to being a great one? And then the author was pretty savvy, and he said, well, let's write basically the same book, change the words around a little bit, and call it From Good to Great for the nonprofit sector, and opened up a whole market of potential readers. But in a sense, the principles are more or less the same. So is there anyone in the room who would say, I don't know, I'm not convinced? Maddie?
Well, I still believe it's harder, but just to make a point for their side, for-profit businesses have more paid employees, so if your business goes under, you're affecting wage, there's a lot more people's livelihoods dependent on you. Rather than, obviously nonprofits still.
But we would say equivalent size companies though. We're the same number of employees.
Oh.
You think of United Way or Red Cross, they are huge nonprofits and they have a lot of employees around the world. So, if they go under, and even with Red Cross during, I think it was Hurricane Katrina, they hit a huge controversy over how they're allocating their funds, and it ended up hurting their donation. They had to lay off a bunch of people. So I mean, I see what you're saying, that if the bigger the company, the more challenging it is, but that would be true whether it's a nonprofit company or a for-profit. Anyone gonna push back against the rest of your classmates and sort of say, I don't know, Mackenzie?
I think that it would be harder to start a for-profit company because I think it takes a lot more capital, and also like if you're trying to sell a product, if you have to make sure that it's comparable or better than other products already on the market, I think there's a lot more competition.
Yeah, there's competition. Brandon?
With the employees, you might have a harder time working with them because in a nonprofit, they're more passionate about the mission of what it is, and in a for-profit, they're going to work, they're just getting money, and most of the time, they're not invested in what the company is about. So it might be harder to bring in all of those employees and confine to the mission of what that for-profit is.
Sure, yeah, I mean, in a sense, hiring an employee for a nonprofit, like my wife, in a sense, she's passionate about the mission, and so she's willing to take a pay cut and even work extra hours and work overtime and not really complain, whereas if this is just my job, there's no way I'm going to work overtime and not get it counted and paid for. So even, the competition for funding, and again, we use Red Cross as the example. Let's say I have $100 that I want to donate. There's a lot of people competing for that $100. There's the local Mother Hubbard food charity, there's the National Red Cross, there's my church, there's my university. Everyone's competing for that $100, and only one person can get it, or I divide it up multiple ways and you get a much smaller amount. So there's competition in that arena as well. Is there someone back here?
I was just gonna say that I feel as though it'd be a lot easier to start up a not-for-profit just because, like you were saying, if people get behind the cause, like where a lot of people care about it, they'll just start throwing money to start up an organization.
Yeah.
But if for a for-profit, if you had a product that would really take off, it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to raise capital and get your company up and going.
Yeah.
And to get people to actually give you money, it's a lot more difficult.
Work out. Yeah. I'm going to push back and actually say that it's just as hard. But part of the reason I do it is because if I asked a room full of Kelly students what's easier, what do you think their answers would be? The nonprofit's easier than the for-profit. But the reason is that we tend to oversimplify the other. So, you have a room full of private sector people who would sort of from a distance look at the nonprofit sector and say, well, you're just managing a bunch of volunteers. And whether or not your company succeeds or fails, there's minimal implications for it. There's no profit that you're losing. Whereas if a for-profit company has a bad quarter, that could cause stock prices to plummet and cause, a downward spiral where the company goes out of business and they have all this capital that they've invested and it's just lost. But on the flip side, when Kelly people, look at the nonprofit, they have different views. And I would argue that both are equally complex. So, basically your arguments were that managing a nonprofit, there's unique management challenges for a nonprofit. And I would say, actually, management and leading an organization is challenging across the board. But it's good to understand sort of how it applies in the nonprofit sector and how it carries over to the private sector. So with nonprofits, but also with private sector companies, you have this idea of mission, money, and management. And I don't think the book talks about market, but it's also there, that even if you're a private sector company, you have a mission. Like Google's mission, their mission is kind of funny. It says do no evil. But their mission is to, create the best search platform in the world for internet searches. Or Facebook's mission is to connect people with one another. It's not just to make money, but there is sort of a mission behind it. You might not agree with the mission, but there's a mission of the organization. And with that is money needed to see that mission become a reality. But that's also true with nonprofits, that you have a mission, and then in order to see that mission become a reality, you need money. And I forget who it was that said, well, it's more challenging to raise money for a nonprofit to get revenues. The same is true for a startup of a private company. You got to get venture capitalists to invest in your idea and to come alongside you and you got to pitch your mission and your idea and get them to invest. So in the same way, as a nonprofit, you're doing fund development, you're really going to a venture capitalist, like a social venture capitalist, saying, invest in me. This is a really good mission of an organization that I want to start up, I want you to invest. So you're sort of recruiting people to join your organization. But that's true whether it's a private company or a nonprofit company. And same with management, you're managing people. I mean, at the end of the day, you're managing people. Probably if you're the leader, you have a clear vision and drivenness for the organization's objectives. And the challenge is getting people to come alongside you to see that become a reality. And I forget who it was, maybe it was Brandon, saying that if you are working for a nonprofit, it's actually slightly easier to lead people in a nonprofit because the mission is more compelling. And so people are on board because they like the mission. Whereas if you're a private company, a lot of times it can be, well, it's just a paycheck. And so, if you work for McDonald's and McDonald's wants to have, great customer service, and imagine, you got a 16-year-old working at McDonald's and you're saying, come on, let's put a smile on your face and like make people happy and make McDonald's the best experience ever. And the 16-year-old is sitting there like, I just want to get paid and I want to get my free dinner out of this. It's like the motivation is not there. And then the fourth one is the market, where there's fierce competition in the nonprofit sector. So a lot of times we think, competition is only in the private sector, but there's actually fierce competition in the nonprofit sector for getting volunteers, for getting funding, for even getting clients. So people are competing, like you're providing this service to the community, but you're actually competing with other nonprofits and even some private companies that are providing the same services, so you're in competition with them. The other thing is that multiple stakeholders. And so with the nonprofit sector, can you think of who are some of the stakeholders, the people who have a vested interest in the success of your organization? Who are some of the stakeholders that you can think of, Cameron?
Who have donated money.
Okay, so the donors are stakeholders. They've just given you a big fat check and they're like, okay, let's see what you do with it and how you're doing. So the funders, what other people are stakeholders? Carly? Okay, so the clients are another stakeholder. So the direct recipients of the services or the products. Other stakeholders that you can think of? People who would care about the success or failure of your organization. Maddie?
People who maybe sold a product to fix a problem that your organization would just kind of get rid of at no cost to people.
Oh, so can you think of an example?
People who sell maybe filters to clean water, but if your organization is just to get safe drinking water to a city, then they probably don't want you.
Okay, or the bottled water company who sells, Nestle sells bottled water around the world, and if you come in and say, well, we're going to set up this well that allows you to extract clean drinking water for free, Nestle might not be very happy about you. So a stakeholder isn't just a cheerleader or someone who wants to see you succeed. A stakeholder can be competition or another industry that it feels threatened by your presence. So that's another type of stakeholder. Any others? Yeah.
The board of directors.
Okay, the board of directors. And why would they be a stakeholder?
Because they have a lot of say and put in quite a bit of effort to the organization and where it's heading. I don't know, I feel like they oversee a lot of the management and leadership in general.
So if I'm the executive director of a nonprofit, I'm basically accountable to the board of directors. And the board of directors, sit down with me on a quarterly basis and kind of do a performance review of not only my performance, but the performance of the whole organization. And whether or not it's keeping on mission, whether or not it has financial solvency as an organization. So that's an important stakeholder. Any other stakeholders? Yeah.
I think that a lot of times the government is a stakeholder because nonprofits are providing a lot of similar services. They're kind of just filling the gap between what the government can't financially provide.
Okay, yeah, and so there might be government regulation, there might be government funding, there might be government guidelines or rules that you need to follow, so that's good. So in a sense, you think, I'm just running the local nonprofit, but you have multiple stakeholders. Other stakeholders are volunteers, because they could be the backbone of your service provision is having these volunteers. So they're another stakeholder. All these people have a vested interest, they have different competing interests, and as a manager or leader of this organization, you got to balance all these multiple stakeholders. It's also true in the private sector, and I'm not sort of trying to be this advocate for the private sector, but I'm trying to help you guys see, no matter what industry you go into, so some of you might be in here saying, well, I'm not going to work for a nonprofit. Actually, all of these things, most everything that we're going to teach in this class relates to nonprofits and for-profits and everything in between. And actually, my hope is that you would land somewhere in between, because that's where where the real fun stuff is happening in the world in terms of these hybrid organizations. But they all have multiple stakeholders that you're juggling. Another aspect of it is multiple bottom lines. So who was it that said differentiate? Was it Alyssa, single bottom line versus double bottom line? Well, so typically it's called triple bottom line. It's profits, people, and planet. So 3 Ps. Profits, people, and planet. Most private organizations have to sort of juggle those 3 bottom lines because you can't just be an organization that's only for profit, but you have to consider how is this affecting the people or the community that our organization is in, and then how is it affecting our planet. And so the nonprofits are sort of farther along in this game. They get that there's multiple bottom lines, but in the private sector as well, you're managing multiple bottom lines. And so a part of it is whatever organization you're running is thinking through, okay, what are the multiple bottom lines that I need to manage? And it's all complex. Nonprofits sort of get that intuitively. The private sector is catching up, saying, hey, it's actually to our benefit to consider other things beyond just the profit of our organization. And then wicked problems. Have you guys heard this term before? So I think it's kind of a fun term. When I first heard it, it was like a very senior faculty member who says, I deal with wicked problems. And I'm like, is he trying to be cool? Or like, what are these wicked problems? But wicked problems is this concept of like intractable problems, seemingly intractable problems that one entity or one organization on its own will not be able to solve. And the only way that these wicked problems could possibly even consider being solved is through collaboration, through massive collaboration, international collaboration, cross-sector collaboration, and it's these organizations that are tackling wicked problems. So, climate change is a classic example of a wicked problem. But even poor educational outcomes within the U.S. or declining educational outcomes in inner city schools or low resource schools is a wicked problem. Or crime and violence in urban areas is a wicked problem. That isn't just one company that's going to come in and solve it, but it's like, okay, we need a massive collective effort to address these problems. But it isn't just the nonprofits who are tackling these big issues. They're actually collaborating with for-profit companies and the government. And so, but I think it's just important to understand, basically saying that nonprofits are a key player in this arena, but they're not the only players, and they need to collaborate with other sectors. And so a lot of it, we want to sort of say, hey, it's really, really hard to lead a nonprofit, and it is, and it's challenging. But you talk to a leader or a manager of another private sector organization or even government entity, and they face very similar problems. They have a mission money management challenges, they have the multiple stakeholders, the multiple bottom lines, and wicked problems that they're addressing. So if you really want to be an effective leader, it's sort of knowing how to manage these things and applying it to your specific context. So where this really becomes challenging is that in the nonprofit sector, ever since about 1980, there's been seismic shifts in the sector. Like this sector got really shaken up in the 1980s, and it's basically President Reagan who came in and said, listen, the way that the nonprofit sector is functioning needs to change, because basically Reagan reduced the size of the government and outsourced a lot of these activities to the nonprofit sector and sort of gave more funding to the sector, but also gave them much more responsibilities. And in the midst of that, decreased the funding. So basically decreased the government programs and decreased the government funding to nonprofits, but basically said that state level, everything was going to be outsourced to the state level to address these issues. The federal government was going to be doing less programs and less funding of these things that should happen at the state level. It was basically a massive attempt to shrink the size of government, and what was hit was the nonprofit sector from both sides. More responsibilities were put onto their shoulders and less funding was available. There was also, Sarbanes-Oxley was a thing that happened in around 2002, which was federal regulations on sort of reporting of finances and all these regulations for the private sector, but it also implicated the nonprofit sector. So all these new regulations where the nonprofit sector was like, how do I, meet all these regulations and policies? And so they had to up their game in understanding federal regulation and policies that before they could just sort of slide under the radar and not really do good accounting practices or follow these strict procedures. But after the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, they were lumped in and saying basically, hey, if you're an organization and you have finances funneling through your organization, you need to follow all these regulations and guidelines. But think about it, if you're working for a nonprofit, you're like, I don't want regulations, I don't want policies, like I'm a good person, just just trust me, that doesn't work anymore. And then also a shifting from grants to vouchers. Probably the best example of this would be the school vouchers. How many have heard of school voucher programs? So school voucher programs, so the way it used to work was the government would just give money to the schools. So it's a charter school or public school, and that school would hire their teachers and buy books and all those things, and they would have a revenue stream of government funding. Well, when they switched, or some states have switched to the voucher system, so instead of going directly to the school, it goes to the parents. And then the parents decide what school they want to enroll their kid in. So there's now a marketplace of school options. So there's the local public school, the charter school, the private Catholic school, the Montessori school, and the parent can take their voucher, which is like $6,000, and decide which school they want to give it to. And so what that does is it creates a competitive market. Because before it was like, well, the public school is going to get all the funding, and so they don't really have to work that hard to get it because it's guaranteed to come to them. But when they do the voucher system, now it's all of a sudden they have to compete with all these other schools if they want to get my $6,000. And it is still controversial in that because people are saying, well, that's pulling money away from public schools and it's going to, oftentimes it was like a religious private school, and they're like, well, why are we funding religion? You know, why should this religious faith-based school get funding? But it wasn't just with schools, it's like with health services. You know, there was usually the public health clinic that would just get all the funding, but now what they're doing is they're giving low-income clients these vouchers, and they choose which health clinic they want to go to. So like, if I'm low income, and so I get this voucher of $1,000 to cover my medical needs, instead of going to the public health clinic, I might go to another clinic. The main thing that it does is it creates a competitive marketplace for funding, which is actually probably a good thing, but it changes the sector. Whereas before you just get one large grant, you just had to appeal to the government to get that huge grant. But now it's being decentralized to all these individuals. So when you hear about voucher system, another example would be food stamps. So it used to be the government would just give large sums of money to these large food distribution centers to give food to people, but instead food stamps, which is another form of voucher system, it's basically giving people money and then they decide where they want to spend that money. And so again, where the nonprofit sector used to sort of have a monopoly on these funding streams and you just had to get the big grant, it's changed. And it's mainly, one aspect is this shifting from grants to the voucher system. What that also does is now you're competing with for-profit organizations. So that's probably the most infuriating thing, is that the services that you're providing, the private sector has stepped in and said, well, we're also going to provide these services too at a low cost or a competitive price. And so now these nonprofits have to compete. So like the clean water programs or whatever, there's for-profit companies that are coming in saying, hey, we'll set up a well for you and it'll cost you this much. And they have good branding and good marketing. And so the nonprofits are like, oh, like, wait, we're the good people. We're just going to set up this well for free. It's not free. It costs you money, but you're doing it through fundraising, and the private sector comes in and they're just competing. Yes, Maddie?
I felt like in the first chapter, it said that there was an increase in like money and visibility, but then here it says there's a decrease in money, so like there was more money circulating in the social sector? Is that
Yes, but not government money.
Oh.
So this is specifically federal government money.
Okay.
The amount of federal government money dropped significantly, and the idea was, let's let the states handle their own needs or whatever. Let's decentralize out to the states, or even get private donors. So the social sector has increasing amounts of money coming in, but it's not where it's coming from has changed. So it's the federal government has pulled back. State governments have sort of stepped in, but really it's private donors that are contributing.
Isn't it still from the government though? Because if they give people vouchers and then the vouchers are used, then isn't that still like the government's money?
Yeah, so one part, and it could be state level too, but the key thing with the vouchers, if I was the executive director of a nonprofit and I needed to get my funding, I could write a grant proposal to the state or federal government and get $100,000. Now I have to get 100 people to give $1,000, which makes it much more difficult. it's much easier just to get the big $100,000 grant from the government. And then with the voucher system, the government sort of said, well, let's make a competitive market and give $1,000 to 100 people, 100 clients, and let them decide where they want to spend their voucher. So it makes it more difficult for me to get my $100,000. Say my budget's $100,000, it makes it more difficult for me to get that now. So the implications for the sector is, and again, this is where it sort of hits home for most of you guys as you think about going into the sector, is that one, it's a blurring of the boundaries and an identity crisis. Sort of how we talked about, is it the nonprofit sector? Is it the social sector? Is it the independent sector? Can I make a profit as a nonprofit? How should I organize my organization? And it's unclear where I'd fit on the continuum of nonprofit, totally for-profit industry. And with that is the identity crisis. I mean, almost all of you in your memos said, why does the nonprofit have such a negative reputation? Like, why is the nonprofit sector perceived the way it is in sort of a negative light? It's an identity crisis of trying to figure out how do we sort of rebrand ourselves as the social sector and sort of get legitimacy and get respect from the other industries. So management, it's a shift in management to where it's much more like running a business. And that's where I sort of go and say, both are difficult, but the main thing is that now you're having to do marketing for your organization, you're having to think about multiple funding streams, larger numbers of employees and volunteer base. So you're running a business, and you think about how you run a business, that's what you're doing, is running a nonprofit. And this is probably the most challenging, but also to me the most exciting, is that the type of leadership that's required to run a nonprofit has changed drastically. Like, you used to just think, oh, you just need to have a passion and sort of set up shop and there's your nonprofit. Leadership, and again, I'll give you guys these slides so you don't have to write down all the things, but first of all, you need to be a professional. Like, you can't be a slacker going into the nonprofit sector and think, oh, I'll just sort of coast. But you need to be a professional as if you're going into any other industry. And also, you need to be entrepreneurial. Like, you really need to think like, okay, this is a startup. Like, I am starting up this new thing, and how am I going to get the ball rolling? And it takes a very much of a social entrepreneurship mindset versus just, well, I'm going to try and do something. It's more thinking through your strategic plan and thinking through creatively, how am I going to make this organization successful, and how am I going to expand it to a larger scale? Also, media savvy. If you think of like all the different fund development opportunities, it's thinking through, like I think about the ALS Foundation, the Bucket Challenge. In a sense, someone from the outside started doing these Bucket Challenge, and the ALS was saying, oh my goodness, like, we have tons of donations coming in, but how can we sort of leverage that to even maximize and have this thing that's going viral? How can we capitalize on that? And a lot of it was understanding how media works and social media as a form of advertising and marketing the organization. Other stuff, politically astute, knowing how to navigate the government and lobbyists in Congress to sort of mitigate some of these challenges with like the grants and the vouchers and funding streams. The last one is empirically astute. In SPIA, do you have to take statistics? Is that required? So the reason why that's so critical is, I guarantee you, if you're running a nonprofit, you're going to sit down with a potential funder. He or she is going to say, I want some empirical evidence of the effectiveness of your program. I want to see the data on why you think your organization is being effective. Now, you don't need a ton of statistics, but you need to be conversant in statistics to be able to show change over time, or to be able to collect data and say, here's what our program does, and here's what sort of the community was like at time one, and then at time two, after we've been in business for a year, here's the changes that we've seen in our community. And so you need to be empirically conversant to show, hey, we're using data to make decisions on where we're going as an organization and to assess the effectiveness of our organization. So when I think about it, being a leader in the nonprofit sector is incredibly demanding. I mean, the skill sets that you need, to me, in many ways, are overwhelming. Like, I'll slide into the private sector because potentially it's just less complexity. Both could be the case. Then also, probably the last thing would be seismic shifts, and this is more the upside of it, the positive stuff that I'm most excited about, are these emerging hybrid models. And so you have social enterprises, which are basically for-profit organizations that have a social mission, like have a social mandate. Like they want to do something good for society, but they're entirely for-profit organizations. And then you have these low-profit limited liability corporations. They're called L3Cs. So you've probably heard of LLCs. It's sort of like you set up a private company. It's a limited liability corporation. Well, the L3Cs is you set up legally as a low-profit organization, such that when you set up a private organization, all profits that you have to go to your stockholders. With these L3Cs, basically you don't have to maximize profit. Like that's not a mandate of your organization. So they've created this category of corporations where your goal doesn't need to be maximizing profit. And then the third one is benefit corporations. B Corp is what they're called. The best way to describe it is it's a certification that you aspire to, sort of like organic. You know, when you go to the grocery store and it says it's organic, you kind of, as a customer, know, oh, this is certified organic, like it's met certain criteria. Now, that's not a government regulation. That's actually a nonprofit that is certified as being organic, or like the school, university, that if it's LEED, L-E-E-D, means it's an environmentally sound building. Well, B corporations is basically there's a certification body that comes in and says, hey, we've deemed your organization to be a benefit corporation, like one that's benefiting society. And again, this is super, super new, and so they're still trying to figure out what it is. I'm going to show a quick video on it because I think it gives you a helpful clarification. And some of you in the memos had said, well, what are these B corporations and L3Cs, and what are examples of them out there? And this video will give you a short sort of overview of what B corporations are. But the important thing is to think about, okay, if I was going to start up a nonprofit, might I want it to be a social enterprise or an L3C or a B corporation? So we'll watch this.
We have a dream that one day all companies will compete not only to be the best in the world, but the best for the world. Others share this dream and have begun to turn the dream into a community. This community signed a Declaration of Interdependence and invited others to join them. Now more than 900 companies from 29 countries are turning our community into a global movement to redefine success in business. B corporations use the power of business to solve social and environmental problems. An eyewear company that disrupts an industry and serves the poor. A food service company that serves over 1 million meals to low-income public school students every week. A manufacturer that goes green and helps workers move from welfare to a career. An online bookseller that recycles used books and funds local libraries and global literacy. An outdoor apparel company that stewards the environment. An ice cream company that maintains its mission post-sale. B Corp is a certification that helps consumers identify these change makers, and investors make money and make a difference. As a community, we are passing laws across the country, creating a new kind of company that serves society and shareholders. We are leading a global movement of people using business as a force for good. Join us. Be the change.
So what are some of your reactions when you think about a nonprofit making a profit or having some sort of revenue generating stream? What are some of your just reactions to that, positive or negative? Yeah.
I think it's positive because it's like kind of an incentive for more people to go into the non-profit, like where they know that they'll still make profit off whatever the company's selling, but they're also doing good at the same time. So it kind of equals out.
So it's a nice balance of, yeah.
I think it makes both sides look good. Like it makes the for-profit look good because they're giving back to the community, but it makes the non-profit look good because people assume that if you're a non-profit, you're not making money. So it gives off the perception that, and the reality that you are making money and making a profit. So it kind of helps both.
Any other drawbacks where you're like, the whole reason I want to be in a nonprofit is because I don't like this money hungry industry of the for-profit sector, or there's a lot of problems with the for-profits. Anyone see potential drawbacks or liabilities to this? Because it is a shift. I mean, in a sense, the push is, hey, we'll start figuring out how you can generate revenue from this service, and you're sitting there saying, no, I'm not interested. I want to provide the service, and I want it to be free, and I don't want to have to worry about making a profit. Yeah.
You might have people who question where that money's going, or they might want it, like there might be operational costs or certain things that you're using that money for, and then you have all of those people, like the board and your clients, that might have different opinions on what the revenue, that stream is being used for.
Yeah, the extra revenue. Like, what are you going to do? And a lot of it, in most instances, is invested back into the organization to expand its operations. But yeah, you when you have money on the table, people get interested. They have a vested interest in where that money goes. So, but I think it's something to be cognizant of and aware of, that this is a shift, and it's becoming more and more popular, and it's becoming more and more unclear. Like, well, how much profit, or how much of a private, what am I? Am I a private company, or am I a nonprofit? Like, what am I? Probably the best example, like we talk about the social sector, the other term would be a social enterprise or social venture capitalist. Like, it's all these, the word is social, but the idea is you have a social mission. You're wanting to start an organization, or you work for an organization that has a social mission. And I sense probably that's the scope, that's a good boundary scope for the people in this classroom, is that you have some sort of vision or idea of an organization that has a social mission. Whether the social is the arts, whether the social is healthcare, whether the social is some sort of international context, there's a social component to the organization that you want to start. Even if you want to start a private company, there's probably some social component to it. So we're going to transition to theories of the nonprofit sector, and I'm going to give you a crash course on the social sciences. So typically when we think of science, we think of the hard sciences like physics and chemistry and biology. Well, there's this whole subsector called the social sciences. It's history, economics, political science, psychology, sociology. And with the social sciences, basically they use the same tools that the hard sciences, that the natural sciences use, but they apply them to society, to how society functions, how society operates, and they make predictions using the scientific method. The basic premise of how the social sciences work is that depending on what discipline you come from, you have a certain orientation or focus. Just like in biology, it's an orientation towards plant life and life in general, whereas within physics, it's about the mechanics of the world, sort of gravity and all the sort of the mechanisms of the world. Well, same within the social sciences, you have orientations. So history looks at society from a certain perspective, psychologists look at society from a certain perspective, and they all have these theories. They all have these theories of how life works, and then they employ methods to test those theories. So this is sort of social science big picture. And these theories operate on two levels. The first is a macro level understanding of the world. So it explains the origins, in terms of the nonprofit sector, it explains the origins and the development of the sector. So it's big picture, like how did all this come about, and where is it going, and how is it developing. And the second part is a micro, like very individual level, like on a small scale level, like behavior within the sector, like why do people volunteer? Or what is it that would cause people to use the services or not use the services provided? So you have people who are trying to explain large-scale questions about the sector as a whole, and then a lot of people trying to explain the micro-level aspects, the day-to-day aspects of the sector, or of the nonprofit sector. So we're going to pull back and look at sort of the macro, the origins or the development of the sector. And what's interesting is that each discipline sort of looks at the sector from a different perspective or a different orientation. The first would be historians. So if you're a historian in the room, your orientation is to think about, who are the critical actors or the movements, or it's like, what were the key events in history that led to the origins and the development development of the nonprofit sector. And we learned about at least the nonprofit sector in the US was a key actor was Andrew Carnegie. Like he was a key historical figure that led to sort of the emergence of the modern day nonprofit sector. But then there are also critical events, like we talked about. Reagan in the 1980s initiated a lot of changes that shifted the trajectory of the nonprofit sector. So the historian is going to look at what is sort of the key actors and events and movements that shape the sector. The economist, if you're an economist in this room, you think all explanation of society can be explained through supply and demand. So who was supplying the nonprofit organizations or services, and was there an increase in supply of the nonprofit sector, or was there a decrease in supply? Like, was the government decreasing its supply, and so then the nonprofit stepped up to increase the supply, or was there an increase in demand that sort of led to the emergence of the nonprofit sector? So the economist is going to look at the sector from a supply and demand perspective. The political scientist, again, these are all social science orientations, but different explanations for the emergence of the sector. The political scientist is going to look at systems of government. So some of you ask, like, is the nonprofit sector in the U.S. unique, or does it exist in other countries around the world? Or is it, how is it different in other places? And so the political scientist would say, well, there's certain systems of governing that foster a nonprofit sector, and there's other systems of governing that basically suppress something like the nonprofit sector. So like in China, there is a nonprofit sector, but it's very different because the government basically says we're going to provide all the needs of the people, and there's not going to be a need for the nonprofit sector. Or you have other places where the government isn't stable enough to sustain a nonprofit sector, but they rely on international nonprofits coming in. And so in a sense, they don't even have a government, so they rely on international nonprofits coming in to provide needs that really the government should be providing. Like even things like electricity or running water, the government's not providing it, so external nonprofits come in and provide it. So political scientists look at, their explanation for the nonprofit sector is it's all about the systems of government that are in place within the countries. The psychologist would say, well, it's really about individual level motivation and behavior. So if you have people who are altruistic and have these benevolent orientations, that's going to lead to the emergence of a nonprofit sector or an altruistic sector. It's based on individual level factors, not systems of government, not supply and demand, but individual psychology is going to drive the emergence. And the last would be sociologists would look at sort of general social structures that exist. Like, are there social movements that are existing that sort of lead to the emergence of entire sectors within the nonprofit arena? And so they would say, or is there structural inequality that exists that sort of pushes people to advocate for more social sector types of organizations? And so the important thing of understanding all these different social science perspectives is that depending on what your particular orientation is, that's going to be how you view the sector and how you view sort of how the sector began and how it develops. And I'm curious, just in this classroom, to know which social science perspective do you most resonate with. Okay, so this is helpful, this is interesting. We have, most of the people are either psychologists or sociologists, very few economists, some historians. But what's helpful with this is not everyone looks at the world from the same perspective or sort of values or privileges certain things over the other. And it shapes the way not only you look at the sector, but also how you see the motivations or development. So the political scientists are going to be more interested in focusing on the government's involvement with the nonprofit sector. The sociologist is probably going to be more interested in sort of social movements and civic action and sort of these large-scale social movements, whereas the psychologist is going to be more focused on individuals and individual behavior and motivation. But it's important to sort of recognize the value and importance of each. So I'll conclude with this, is sort of why did the social sector emerge, or why did the nonprofit sector emerge? And there's some key explanations for this. But basically, some of them was that they address the underrepresented or marginalized. So in a sense, the government provides all these human services to people that are these public goods. But there's some people, some sectors of society that are on the margins or on the fringes, and they get missed, or they don't get the services. And so the nonprofit nonprofit steps in to meet these people, whether it be because of financial needs or because of social stigma. So if you think of like, let's say, orphans. A lot of orphans are not in part of a traditional family structure, and so they have needs that it's hard for them to receive government benefits. And so nonprofits start up these orphanages to help these people who are on the margins. But it's also even people groups, so if you think that LGBTQ community, that they're not represented by government laws. Like, so there's no discrimination laws against people based on sexual orientation. And so you have nonprofits, advocacy organizations that start up for people in fringe communities or marginalized or underrepresented communities. Also, it's emerged to address long-term problems. So if you're a politician and you're sort of wanting to pass a bill in government, you're not going to pass a bill to address climate change because that's like a 60-year horizon initiative. You want to pass a bill for something that's going to provide immediate results. And so any type of long-term problem, government doesn't really want to take that on because it's not politically efficient for them to do that. And so that's where nonprofits step in. And then also to address emergent issues. So like Orlando Change is an example of this. Like, to rapidly raise money, the government won't be able to do it, but a nonprofit can just set up shop, set up a website, and quickly raise money in a much more efficient way. And then another one is to incubate social programs. So like pre-K, you know, kindergarten, pre-K, that was started by nonprofits saying, well, let's try this out in communities to have a pre-K program, and they've run it and it's been successful. And so now the government is going to take it on and say, okay, yeah, more and more schools are going to have pre-K programs. So it's a way to test new programs out. We'll end there, and on Thursday, come be ready to join a group that's going to start a nonprofit. So come with your ideas for a nonprofit. I'm going to put some readings on Canvas. They're short readings, but they're important for starting the nonprofit.